Snow drifted gently over Anchorage, Alaska, painting the city in shades of white and silver. The streets bustled with last-minute shoppers carrying brightly colored bags, their breath clouding the air as they hurried between stores. Christmas lights strung along storefronts and lampposts reflected off the icy pavement, casting a warm glow against the frigid night. Above it all, the northern lights shimmered faintly, an ethereal ribbon across the darkened sky. High above the city, on the top floor of a sleek glass and steel building, Ben Charles sat alone in his office. The space was immaculate, with sharp, modern lines and an air of sterile perfection. A minimalist desk held only a laptop, a stack of neatly aligned papers, and a single pen. Behind Ben, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, the twinkling lights below contrasting sharply with the cold emptiness of the room. Ben's focus was unbroken as his fingers danced across the keyboard, the glow of his monitor casting a faint blue light on his face. At 30, Ben Charles was one of Anchorage's youngest and most successful investment bankers. His sharp jawline, perfectly combed dark hair, and piercing blue eyes made him the subject of admiration in professional circles, but there was a chill to him that repelled as much as it attracted. The soft sound of a knock at the door broke his concentration. Ben's gaze flicked up, irritation flashing in his eyes. "What is it?" The door creaked open, and a young man stepped hesitantly inside. Cody Pratt was barely 22, dressed in a simple button-down shirt and tie that looked slightly too big for his slender frame. His dark curls were tousled, and despite the lateness of the hour, his wide brown eyes carried a hopeful energy that seemed out of place in the austere office. "Mr. Charles," Cody began, his voice tentative but warm, "I just wanted to wish you a Merry Christmas before I head out for the night." Ben leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Christmas," he said, his tone laced with derision. "Just another excuse for people to shirk responsibilities and spend money they don't have. I trust your work is finished?" Cody faltered, his smile dimming slightly. "Yes, sir. Everything's done. I even stayed late to finish the quarterly report." Ben's gaze sharpened. "Then what are you still doing here? If you're done, go. Otherwise, I suggest you focus on what matters." For a moment, Cody seemed to struggle with whether to say more. His fingers tightened on the strap of his bag. "Right, well, Merry Christmas, Mr. Charles." His voice was softer this time, but the warmth lingered. He turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Ben exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. The boy's cheerfulness was exhausting. He returned to his work, but the interruption had frayed his focus. Moments later, the door opened again, and Ben frowned. "I thought I made myself—" He stopped mid-sentence as a man he didn't recognize stepped into the room. The man had an effortless presence that immediately filled the space. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a simple but well-worn jacket and jeans. His brown hair curled slightly at the edges, and his face, though rugged, carried a kindness that made it hard to look away. "Mr. Charles," the man said, his voice steady and warm, "I'm Adam. I run the North Circle LGBTQIA+ youth shelter." He stepped forward, holding out a small flyer. "We provide a safe space for LGBTQ+ teens who've been rejected by their families. With Christmas tomorrow, we're hosting a dinner to make sure no one's left alone. I'm here to ask for your help to make it all possible." Ben's eyes narrowed as he leaned back in his chair, studying Adam with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "A donation," he repeated slowly, as if the word itself was distasteful. "So, you're asking me to fund handouts for people who can't manage their own lives?" Adam's smile tightened, but he didn't falter. "I'm asking you to help kids who've been thrown out of their homes for being who they are. Kids who have nowhere else to go. This isn't about handouts. It's about giving them a chance to survive." Ben raised an eyebrow. "Survival? Let me tell you something, Mr. Adam. The world doesn't reward weakness. Charity only prolongs failure. If you want these kids to succeed, teach them to fend for themselves." The room fell silent. Adam held Ben's gaze, his brown eyes unwavering. Then, without a word, he placed the flyer on the edge of Ben's desk. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Charles," he said quietly, his voice steady but tinged with disappointment. He turned and walked out, leaving Ben alone once more. Ben stared at the flyer for a moment, the bold letters announcing North Circle LGBTQIA+ Youth Shelter Christmas Dinner, all are welcome. With a sigh, he swept it aside and returned to his work. By the time he arrived at his high-rise apartment, the city below was quiet, the bustle of Christmas Eve winding down. His home was a stark contrast to the festive streets, a pristine expanse of glass, steel, and leather furniture. There were no decorations, no tree, no lights. Just the cold, clinical elegance of a man who had long since stopped caring about the holidays. Pouring himself a glass of wine, Ben sank into his leather armchair and stared out the window. The northern lights shimmered faintly in the distance, but he barely noticed. His thoughts turned briefly to Riley, his nephew. Riley was the son of Ben's sister, Allison, a woman who had been everything to him once. She had raised him in the wake of their father's coldness, her laughter and warmth, the only bright spots in his otherwise harsh upbringing. Her death years ago had left a void Ben hadn't tried to fill. Riley had inherited her spirit, cheerful, kind, and endlessly persistent. Earlier that day, he had stopped by the office to invite Ben to Christmas dinner, just as he did every year. "Uncle Ben, it'd mean so much to have you there," Riley had said, his voice hopeful. "I'm only 5 years older than you. Don't call me uncle," Ben said. Riley smiled. "I'm busy anyway," Ben said, looking back to his work. Now, in the stillness of his apartment, Ben felt the faintest flicker of guilt. But he pushed it aside, taking another sip of wine. Christmas was just another day, no different from any other. Or so he thought. The room suddenly grew cold. The air seemed to thicken, and Ben shivered, his breath visible in the dim light. A sound, low and metallic, echoed faintly, growing louder with each passing second. Ben froze as the shadows in the room deepened, coalescing into a figure. Draped in glowing chains, his translucent form illuminated by an eerie light, stood John Bailey, Ben's former business partner and ex-boyfriend. "John?" Ben whispered, his voice trembling. The ghost stepped forward, his face a mix of sorrow and urgency. "Ben," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally, "I've come to warn you. Tonight, you will be visited by 3 spirits. They are your last chance to change, your last chance to avoid my fate." The chains around John rattled as he raised a hand, pointing toward the clock. It struck midnight, the chime reverberating through the room. And then, John was gone. The clock struck 12, each chime reverberating through the stillness of Ben's apartment. He sat frozen in his leather armchair, wine forgotten in his hand, as the echoes of the final chime faded. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural chill. For a moment, Ben wondered if he'd fallen asleep at his desk earlier and was now dreaming. He set the glass down, the faint tremble in his hand betraying the fear he refused to acknowledge. The shadows in the room seemed to shift again, moving like living things. And then, without warning, a blinding light filled the space. Ben shielded his eyes, squinting against the sudden brightness. When the light faded, he lowered his arm and blinked. Standing before him was a man unlike any Ben had ever seen. The figure was young, perhaps in his early 20s. His skin seemed to glow faintly, and his golden hair framed a face that was both innocent and mischievous. "Benjamin Charles," the man said, his voice soft yet commanding. It carried an almost musical quality, each word lingering in the air like a note in a symphony. Ben stood abruptly, straightening his shoulders. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. though his voice lacked its usual edge. The man smiled, tilting his head slightly. "I am the ghost of Christmas past," he said simply. "I am here to show you what once was." Ben narrowed his eyes, his pulse quickening. "Show me? I don't need anyone to show me the past. I lived it and am still living it. Whatever game this is, I'm not interested." The ghost's smile widened, his golden eyes gleaming. "You're right. Your past isn't as far away from you now as it is for others. It still lingers in everything you do, and it shapes who you are." Before Ben could agree, the ghost reached out and took his hand. The touch was cold but strangely comforting, like dipping fingers into a mountain stream. The room around them began to dissolve, the walls and furniture melting away into a swirl of light and shadow. Ben's breath caught in his throat as he felt himself being pulled forward, weightless and untethered. When the light faded, they were no longer in Ben's apartment. Instead, they stood in a small, cozy living room. The faint scent of pine filled the air, mingling with the aroma of fresh cookies. "This," Ben began, his voice barely a whisper. "This is my childhood home." The ghost didn't respond, simply watching as Ben turned, his eyes wide as they took in the familiar space. The furniture was old but lovingly cared for, the walls adorned with hand-stitched decorations. A modest Christmas tree stood in the corner, its branches laden with homemade ornaments and strings of popcorn. And then Ben saw them. A young boy sat on the floor by the tree, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he meticulously tied a red ribbon around a small package. His shoulders were hunched, and there was a quiet determination in his movements. Nearby, a woman knelt beside him, her laughter filling the room like music. "Allison," Ben whispered, his chest tightening. The woman looked up. She was beautiful, with warm brown eyes and a smile that could light up even the darkest day. Her hands moved deftly as she adjusted the boy's ribbon, her touch gentle and affectionate. "You've almost got it, Benny," she said, her voice soft and encouraging. "Just a little tighter, and it'll be perfect." The boy, young Ben, nodded, his tongue poking out slightly as he concentrated. When he finally tied the ribbon, he looked up at Allison, a rare smile breaking across his face. "See? I did it!" Allison laughed, pulling him into a hug. "Of course you did. You always do." Ben watched the scene unfold, his throat tightening as he tried to swallow the lump forming there. He remembered this moment, one of the few Christmases when Allison had made everything feel normal, even happy. Their father had been working late that night, leaving them alone to decorate the tree and exchange small gifts they'd made for each other. "She was everything to you," the ghost said softly, breaking the silence. "She protected you, cared for you, when no one else did." Ben turned sharply to the ghost, his eyes narrowing. "I don't need you to tell me that. I know what Allison meant to me." The ghost's expression didn't change. "Do you? Or have you buried those memories so deep that you've forgotten how much love you once had?" Before Ben could respond, the scene shifted again. The warm glow of the living room dissolved, replaced by the sterile cold of a hospital room. Ben stiffened, his jaw tightening as the sound of faint beeping filled the air. Allison lay in the bed, her once vibrant face pale and drawn. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing was labored. Ben, older now but still years younger than his current self, sat beside her, his head bowed and his hands clenched in his lap. "She was the last person you let into your heart," the ghost said quietly. "And when she was gone, you built walls so high that no one could ever get close to you again." Ben's fists clenched as he turned away, his chest heaving. "Enough," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't need to see this." The ghost stepped closer, his golden eyes filled with both sorrow and resolve. "You must. You've spent years running from your past, Ben, but it's time to face it." The scene faded, and suddenly Ben was back in his apartment, and the beeping of the machines replaced by the cold silence of his high-rise. He stumbled back into his chair, his heart racing. The ghost of Christmas past stood before him, his glow dimming slightly. "This is only the beginning, Ben," he said. "The choices you made, the love you lost, they've shaped the man you are today. But you still have time to change." Before Ben could respond, the ghost began to fade, his form dissolving into a swirl of golden light. The room grew still once more, leaving Ben alone with his thoughts. He pressed his hands to his face, his breathing uneven. The past he had buried so carefully had been laid bare, and the weight of it pressed heavily on his chest. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed once. The night was far from over. The second chime echoed through Ben's apartment, deeper and more resonant than the first. He sat motionless in his chair, staring at the dark window as his reflection stared back, pale and shaken. The memories stirred by the ghost of Christmas past lingered in his mind, heavy and unrelenting. Then came the sound of movement, soft footsteps, accompanied by a warm, low laugh. Ben turned sharply, his chest tightening. Standing in the center of the room was a man unlike anyone Ben had ever met. There was an unmistakable air of authority about him, as though he carried the entire season on his shoulders. "Benjamin Charles," the man said, his rich voice filling the room like a warm embrace. "I'm the ghost of Christmas present." Ben rose slowly, his gaze wary. "Another one?" he asked, his tone edged with disbelief. "What are you here to show me?" The ghost smiled, stepping forward with easy confidence. "Come and see for yourself." He extended a hand, his palm open and inviting. Ben hesitated, but finally reached out, his fingers brushing the ghost's hand. Instantly, the room dissolved into a swirl of light and sound, the transition so seamless that Ben didn't have time to brace himself. When the light faded, they stood in a small, cluttered apartment. The faint smell of something savory lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of pine from a tiny Christmas tree in the corner. The tree's sparse branches were draped with hand-me-down ornaments and strands of tinsel, giving it a humble charm. A string of colored lights blinked faintly, illuminating a modest table set for two. Ben's attention shifted to the figure bustling around the kitchen. It was Cody Pratt, wearing an oversized sweater with a goofy snowman on the front. He hummed off-key as he stirred a pot on the stove, his face glowing with an energy that seemed to light up the whole apartment. "Cody lives here?" Ben asked, frowning as he looked around. "With his boyfriend, Noah," the ghost replied, nodding toward the living room. Ben followed the ghost's gaze and saw a man sitting on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket. Noah was pale, his slender frame visibly weakened, but his smile was warm as he watched Cody move about. A cough escaped him, soft but persistent, and he reached for a glass of water on the coffee table. Cody appeared almost instantly, placing a bowl of soup in Noah's lap and sitting beside him. He adjusted the blanket around Noah's shoulders, his expression full of quiet determination. "Noah's been struggling with his health for months now," the ghost said softly, "and Cody does everything he can to take care of him. Between work and hospital visits, he barely sleeps." Ben's frown deepened as he watched Cody lean closer to Noah, brushing a kiss to his forehead. There was so much love in that simple gesture, so much strength in the way Cody carried himself. "He could have left," the ghost continued. "It would have been easier. But love doesn't take the easy way out." Ben folded his arms, his jaw tightening. "What does this have to do with me? I'm not responsible for his personal life." The ghost turned to him, his smile fading slightly. "No, but you pay him so little that he barely gets by, and he's too proud to ask for more." Before Ben could respond, the scene shifted. They now stood in a large, bustling hall. Long tables stretched across the room, covered with steaming plates of food. Strings of rainbow lights crisscrossed above, and a giant tree stood in one corner, its branches adorned with ornaments made by hand. Ben turned, his ears filled with the sound of laughter and conversation. People moved from table to table, sharing food and stories. Young adults, most of them between 17 and 21, gathered in groups, their faces a mix of cautious hope and tentative joy. "This is the North Circle LGBTQIA+ Youth Center," the ghost explained, gesturing to the vibrant scene. Ben's gaze caught on a familiar figure moving through the crowd. It was Adam, the man who had come to his office earlier that day. He carried 2 steaming cups of cider, handing one to a young man sitting near the tree. The young man had dark circles under his eyes and a hesitant smile that grew brighter as Adam spoke to him. "Adam," Ben murmured, his chest tightening. "Yes," the ghost said, "the man who asked for your help and was turned away." Ben watched as Adam knelt beside the young man, placing a hand on his shoulder. The young man nodded, his face lighting up as Adam spoke to him. "These kids come here because they have nowhere else to go," the ghost said, his tone grave. "Thrown out of their homes, rejected by their families. They come here for safety, for community, for a chance to believe in something again. And Adam gives it to them." Ben looked away, his expression hardening. "What does that have to do with me? I'm not responsible for them, either." The ghost's gaze was steady, his voice soft. "No, you're not. But you could be part of the solution. Instead, you choose to turn your back." The ghost gestured toward Adam again. Ben hesitated, his eyes lingering on the man's easy smile and the way the kids gravitated toward him like moths to a flame. Adam moved with purpose, making every person he approached feel seen and valued. "Do you think it's easy for him?" the ghost asked, his voice quieter now. "Carrying the weight of so many lives, knowing he can't save them all? And yet, he doesn't stop trying." Ben remained silent, the tension in his chest growing heavier with every passing moment. The ghost turned to him, his warm expression replaced by something sterner. "You can keep pretending you don't care, Ben. But deep down, you know the truth. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Ben could answer, the scene dissolved, and he was back in his apartment. The golden glow of the youth center was gone, replaced by the dim, sterile light of his home. The clock struck 2. The clock on the mantel ticked louder than before, the sound a harsh reminder of time slipping away, each second heavy with the weight of past regrets and choices yet to be made. Ben stood by the window, staring out at the snowy streets of Anchorage, the world below a stark contrast to the warmth that should have filled his home. His breath fogged up the glass, and he wiped it away absently with the back of his hand. The ghost's words lingered in his mind like an echo, relentless and painful. And then, once more, the air shifted. A sudden chill swept through the room, a presence so intense that Ben could feel the hair on the back of his neck rise. He turned slowly, and there, standing before him, was the ghost of Christmas future. His face was unreadable, but there was something about his eyes. Cold, distant, as though he had seen too much to still believe in hope. His dark hair fell in controlled waves, and his expression was almost too perfect, too polished, as if the man was made of shadows and light. Ben felt his pulse quicken, unease creeping into his chest. The ghost stepped forward, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he extended his hand to Ben. "I'm not here to show you a distant future," the ghost said, in a voice that sent a shiver down Ben's spine. "I'm here to show you what's already beginning, what you've already set in motion." Ben hesitated, then took the ghost's hand. The moment his fingers touched the man's, the room around him dissolved, the world twisting and blurring. He felt a sickening lurch in his stomach as he was transported to a new scene, one that made his heart race with dread. They were standing in a cold, dimly lit hospital room. The faint beeping of machines echoed through the sterile space, and the scent of antiseptic was overpowering. Ben's stomach churned as his gaze fell on the figure in the bed. It was Noah, pale and frail, his once sharp features now drawn with exhaustion. A thin, almost translucent layer of sweat clung to his skin. Tubes snaked from his body, and the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor sounded like a countdown, too precise, too inevitable. Ben's chest tightened. No, this can't be. The ghost stood beside him, silent but firm. This is the result of Cody's choices, yes, but it is also a reflection of your neglect. Cody Pratt was there, his face hollow with grief. His hand grasped Noah's, his fingers weak from exhaustion. Cody's clothes were disheveled, his eyes sunken from sleepless nights, his hair tangled and unkempt. Despite his obvious fatigue, his expression was one of quiet determination, but Ben could see it now, how Cody was barely holding on, how the weight of the world had crushed him under the unrelenting pressure of trying to care for a sick partner while barely making ends meet. Cody had turned down multiple job offers to stay with Noah, to be there for him in his most fragile moments. But now, Ben could see the results of his sacrifice. No job, no savings, no future. And Noah's condition had only worsened, the disease eating away at him, unchecked and unchallenged. Ben's heart twisted with guilt. I should have, could have, done something. I could have helped. The ghost's voice was low, his tone somber. You could have, but you didn't. The scene shifted again. The hospital room faded, and they were standing in a small, grimy apartment. The walls were yellowed with age, the furniture sparse and worn. The faint glow of a single light bulb cast long shadows across the room. And in the corner, Ben could see Adam sitting at a small table. His shoulders were hunched as he scribbled something onto a notepad, his brow furrowed in concentration. But as Ben watched, he saw the weariness in Adam's face. The exhaustion was etched into every line, every crevice of his skin. His eyes were hollow from sleepless nights, and his once bright smile had faded into something thinner, more brittle. Adam was alone. Ben could feel the loneliness radiating off of him, the isolation that had become his constant companion. Without the support he had once hoped to get from Ben, Adam was struggling to keep the youth center alive. Donations were dwindling, and the kids who needed his help the most were beginning to feel the cold sting of rejection from the world. Adam had tried everything: fundraisers, outreach, finding new ways to stay afloat. But it wasn't enough. In the corner of the room, a file lay open, showing eviction notices stacked one on top of the other. The rent was past due. The bills were piling up. Adam's hope, once so strong, was fraying at the edges. His fingers trembled as he continued to write, his mind preoccupied with a future he couldn't see, couldn't afford to see. The ghost's voice cut through the silence. Do you see it now, Ben? Do you understand the weight of what you've ignored? Ben's throat tightened, and he could feel tears welling up in his eyes. I didn't know. I didn't think. I thought they could manage it. I thought. The ghost moved, his form shifting like a shadow, as he led Ben out of the apartment and into another scene. This time, they were standing on a street corner, bathed in the harsh glow of street lights. The snow had begun to fall in heavy sheets, the wind howling around them. Ben's eyes darted to a figure standing in the distance. Cody Pratt again, but this time, his face was different. His cheeks were gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his clothes were tattered. He held a small cup in his hands, offering it to anyone who would stop. His eyes were vacant, defeated. The sparkle of hope Ben had seen in him just days before was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of loss. Cody was no longer caring for Noah. He was no longer the bright, hopeful young man trying to keep his world together. He had fallen through the cracks, alone, abandoned by everyone he had trusted. The ghost's voice was like a cold wind cutting through Ben's soul. Cody didn't make it out, Ben. Nor did Noah. The scene shifted once more, and this time, Ben found himself standing alone in his office. It was late, the lights of the building flickering off as snow piled up against the windows. The desk before him was empty. No papers, no contracts. Just a lonely, cold space. There was no one left. No business to run. No one who cared. Ben had pushed everyone away, and now, even the empire he had worked so hard to build was crumbling to dust. The silence was deafening. His once proud office now nothing more than a hollow shell. "Do you understand now, Ben?" the ghost asked, his voice gentle but final. "You could have saved them. You could have been the difference. But instead, you chose to stand by and watch it all unravel." Ben opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His heart was heavy, his mind spinning. The future he had feared, the future he had worked so hard to avoid, was staring him in the face. And he realized, with sickening clarity, that he was the one who had written this story. As the ghost's presence began to fade, Ben felt an odd pull, a sense of something closing in on him. The world around him seemed to collapse into a blur as the cold, sterile silence of the office swallowed him whole. But the sensation didn't stop there. The room around him twisted, the walls stretching and bending like shadows. A weight settled over him, a pressure building on his chest. He blinked, and suddenly he wasn't standing in his office anymore. He was in a different room now, dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of decay. It wasn't the modern, sleek office he had built over the years. This place was old, worn, forgotten, like a part of him he had long discarded. His heart raced as his eyes scanned the space, and then it hit him. He was standing in a bedroom, his own bedroom. But it wasn't the vibrant, well-kept space it once was. No, this room was a shadow of what it had been. The furniture was old, covered in dust, the walls cracked with age. The bed, too, looked smaller now, lonelier, with nothing but a single, unmade blanket tossed across it. The room felt suffocating, the silence absolute. And there, in the center of it all, was Ben himself. Older, much older, his features drawn and sunken. His hair had grayed, his skin pale, marked by the passage of time and the loneliness he had carried for years. He lay there in the bed, staring at the ceiling, but there was no one else with him. No Cody. No Adam. No Riley. No one. Just Ben. Alone. Ben's throat tightened. His heart ached as he looked at the figure on the bed. The older version of himself was still, unmoving, as if resigned to his fate. His chest felt heavy, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He wanted to scream, to run, to stop it all from happening, but his voice was trapped in his throat. This future, this moment, felt inescapable. He saw it all. The years of isolation, the missed chances, the countless moments where he had turned his back on the people who mattered. The relationships that had slipped through his fingers like sand, each one further eroding any sense of meaning in his life. He had spent so long focusing on the facade of success, of professional triumph, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly connect with someone, to love, to care. And now, as he lay there in the shadow of his own regrets, it was too late. The room grew colder, the silence even more oppressive. The older Ben didn't move, didn't acknowledge him. He was a ghost of his former self, trapped in a life he had chosen, a life where no one cared to reach out, no one to say goodbye, no one to mourn him when he was gone. Ben took a trembling step closer, his voice barely a whisper. "No, I don't want this. Please. I can change. I can still—" His words caught in his throat, swallowed by the quiet of the room. But there was no answer, no comfort. Only the sound of his own heartbeat, slow and steady, fading with each passing moment. The ghost's voice, distant but final, echoed in the cold space. You chose this, Ben. You chose to keep them at arm's length. You chose to turn your back on love, on kindness, on all that could have been. And this is the life you built. Ben felt the weight of those words like a physical blow. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, his hands gripping the worn carpet as his vision blurred with tears. He wanted to scream, to shake himself awake from this nightmare, but the reality of what he was seeing was undeniable. This was his future, this hollow, empty life, and it was already slipping through his fingers, the last remnants of his humanity vanishing like smoke. He looked once more at the older version of himself. The man in the bed, alone, forgotten, a faded ghost of the person he could have been, looked up slowly, his eyes hollow, devoid of the spark of life. Ben's voice cracked. I don't want to die like this, not alone. The air was crisp and still when Ben awoke. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he didn't know where he was. The darkness of night clung to his surroundings, the room cold from the early morning chill. But the events of the past night, the ghostly visits, the visions of a lonely future, faded like a forgotten dream. The weight that had pressed so heavily on his chest, the suffocating solitude that had filled his life, was gone. Instead, he felt something stirring inside him, something unfamiliar but welcome. A sense of clarity, a rush of energy, a feeling of possibility. Ben sat up in bed, his heart racing, a little dizzy. He blinked, trying to orient himself. The familiar surroundings of his modern Anchorage apartment came into focus. Sleek furniture, warm, neutral colors, and the low hum of city life beyond the windows. The stark contrast between this present reality and the dismal future he had seen was startling. He wasn't alone. He wasn't in that cold, sterile room anymore. He wasn't the older, forgotten man lying in bed, consumed by regret and isolation. He was here. He was alive. And most importantly, he still had time. Ben stood up quickly, a new fire in his veins. The urgency was overwhelming. He had wasted so many years of cold ambition, years of pushing people away, years spent on things that ultimately didn't matter. But now he could do something different. He could change. He could fix the mistakes he had made before it was too late. His heart pounded as he hurried to get dressed. Every movement was full of intention, every action deliberate. He couldn't waste another moment. He needed to make things right. The room felt different, brighter, warmer, as he zipped up his coat and tied his boots. He grabbed his phone from the bedside table, and with shaking hands, he opened his messages. His mind immediately went to Riley, his nephew. Riley was the one person who had always tried to reach out, even when Ben had pushed him away. Ben had isolated himself, closed himself off from the family that cared for him. But that was all about to change. Riley, I'm coming over. I need to talk to you. It's important. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need to. He was already out the door and into the cold, fresh morning air, the snowy streets of Anchorage welcoming him with their peaceful silence. The city was still asleep, but Ben's world had already shifted. It was Christmas morning, a new beginning, a chance at redemption. As he walked through the snow-covered streets, he felt a strange lightness, as though the burden he had carried for years had been lifted. He had made a choice. And now, he was going to make things right. When he arrived at Riley's apartment, he didn't hesitate. He knocked firmly on the door, the sound echoing in the stillness of the morning. A few moments passed before Riley opened the door, his face lit up with surprise. Ben? Riley said, blinking in disbelief. What are you doing here? It's Christmas. I know, Ben replied, his voice thick with emotion. I know it's Christmas and I've been a fool. I've been pushing people away for too long, especially you. But I'm here now. I need to tell you that I've changed. I've realized that I've wasted so much time. I've been living the wrong way. I've ignored the people who care about me." Riley's eyes softened, and for a moment, he didn't speak, as though processing the sincerity in Ben's words. "Ben, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want to be a part of your life," Ben said, his voice stronger now. "I've been so focused on my work, my success, but it hasn't brought me happiness. I've built walls around myself, and I've kept everyone out. But I don't want to do that anymore. I want to be here for you. I want to be there for my family. I want to fix things." Riley didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, staring at Ben, as though trying to gauge whether this was real or just a passing impulse. But then his eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You really mean it?" Ben nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of hope and fear. "I do. I want to make things right." Riley stepped aside, motioning for Ben to come inside. "You're welcome here, anytime, Ben. You know that." Ben stepped into Riley's apartment, the warmth of the space filling him with a sense of belonging. He hadn't realized just how much he missed it until now, how much he had missed them. Riley, his nephew, the person who had always believed in him, always cared for him. The weight that had hung between them for years felt lighter, and Ben knew that this was only the beginning. Later that morning, Ben went straight to the LGBTQ+ Youth Center. The center was quiet when he arrived. Adam was at his desk, busy with paperwork. "Ben?" Adam looked up in surprise. "It's Christmas. What are you doing here?" "I've come to say I'm sorry, and I want to help. I want to make sure this place does well. I want to be a part of it. I want to help you make this thrive." Adam stared at him, clearly shocked by his words. "You're serious?" "Absolutely," Ben said, his resolve unwavering. "I want to help keep this place going. I want to make sure that it's here for years to come, to give people like you and the youth who come here a place to call home. And people like me too. I was lucky to not lose the roof over my head, but I can't imagine what it's like for those who weren't." Adam stood, his eyes welling up with emotion. "Ben, that means everything. You don't know how much this means." Ben shook his head. "No, you don't know how much it means to me." As the day wore on, Ben found himself working side by side with Adam, reaching out to the community, offering his support in any way he could. He didn't stop there. He reached out to Noah, offering him help with his medical expenses. He helped Cody and his boyfriend find resources to ensure Cody's boyfriend received the care he needed. He called Riley again, reminding him that he was there for him and that he would always be there from now on. By the end of the day, Ben had done more than he ever thought he could in such a short time. And when he finally returned home that evening, he felt different. The house didn't feel empty anymore. The walls didn't feel so cold. He stood on his balcony, gazing out at the snowy streets of Anchorage. The Christmas lights twinkled in the distance, reflecting in the fresh snow. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs, but it didn't feel harsh. It felt refreshing. The city had a different energy now, and so did he. He wasn't the same man who had walked through those streets earlier. He wasn't the cold, distant business person anymore. He was someone who cared, someone who had learned the value of love, connection, and kindness. The past was behind him, but the future was still his to shape. And for the first time in a long time, Ben believed that he could create a life full of meaning, of love, of purpose. Ben closed his eyes, smiling to himself. The ghosts of Christmas had shown him his path, and now he was walking it with his head held high. He wasn't alone anymore. He had everything he needed right in front of him. And it was just the beginning.